Impact of influenza, something that we tend to very much underestimate. William Farr, who worked in the British Records Office back in the 1800s, described what we now know as excess mortality associated with influenza. We also see excess hospitalisation, which runs pretty much parallel to this. So what is excess mortality? Well, Farr was looking at death certificates and the causes of death shown on death certificates around that time. And there was this background of things that were going on, whooping cough, consumption, TB, measles, diphtheria, etc. He found when he got an epidemic of typhoid, there was suddenly a big spike of typhoid marked death certificates. Nothing else changed. And the same thing happened with cholera. But when there was an epidemic of influenza, lo and behold, there were a lot of death certificates that said influenza, but there were a lot more death certificates that said other things such as heart disease, pneumonia, diabetes, stroke, kidney failure. And these are things that are precipitated, deaths that have been precipitated by infection with influenza, and it's gone on many occasions unrecognised that influenza was the thing that precipitated this. And we have data from Australia and New Zealand and the USA all indicating that this excess is about 10 times the number of deaths that are actually recorded with influenza on the death certificate. So we grossly underestimate this disease if we're not very careful. In America, they do a very nice job of actually tracking influenza each year, and they look at influenza and pneumonia mortality. And they've got a curve here, which I've shown, which is the anticipated, if there's nothing unusual happening. And then in years where there's a major outbreak, a big epidemic, the red line shows that it exceeds this quite dramatically on certain occasions. And most of those deaths are occurring in older people. Once you get over the age of 65, you're more likely to die if you contract influenza. But then once you get over the age of about 80, you're much more likely to die. And just showing a little blip at the beginning of this curve because very young infants are also susceptible, potentially could die from influenza. But it's not only the known at-risk people, the older people, or people with underlying risk conditions that are totally susceptible to mortality from influenza. I collected for a period of time newspaper cuttings of unexpected deaths in young, otherwise healthy people, and these build up and make quite a dramatic story that young people can in fact die unexpectedly from influenza when they've had no other underlying causes. And in the 2009 pandemic, this H1N1 pandemic in Australia, approximately a third of the 191 deaths and of the large number of ICU admissions, intensive care admissions, were in young adults with no unidentified risk factors. And most commonly there was lung involvement. The virus actually invaded the lungs in those people. And we just have a look here at a graph showing where the deaths occurred over a number of years in Australia, going back to 2000 and up to 2009, the pandemic year. And what you see is generally in older people, as I said earlier. In 2009, it was a relatively mild year in terms of numbers of deaths, surprisingly, because there was so much influenza around. But it did attack younger people. And if we measure the impact of influenza in terms of the number of years of productive life lost, this was quite dramatically different in 2009 to most other years. Now, influenza causes illness, serious illness and death in several ways. It can invade the lower respiratory tract. It's normally an upper respiratory tract infection, but occasionally it gets right down into the lungs and causes pneumonia or pneumonitis, and that certainly happened in 2009. And a lot of people were kept alive. We're very fortunate to be able to survive that by these extracorporeal membrane oxygenation systems, artificial lungs, if you like. And a lot of people were wired up like this picture for days or even weeks while their lungs recovered enough for them to be able to breathe again. Also, the virus does predispose to bacterial infection. I talked about the little cilia that keep your respiratory tract clean. On the left here is a typical respiratory tract before it's been infected, and to the right after influenza infection. And influenza wipes out these little cells on the surface with these cleaning cilia on them, and it predisposes to bacterial infection, so you get bacterial pneumonias can take over. And also, as we get older, our physiology becomes compromised. I've just shown on here lung capacity as one of the things that you can measure. Heart capacity, kidney capacity, all of those things become more compromised with aging. And if you have a severe infection, that can actually cause organ failure. You can actually die simply because you're not physiologically as strong as you used to be, and this is why older people do succumb to influenza. And pregnant women also succumb because of their compromised immune systems and because of their compromised respiratory tract. And there are a whole lot of strange things happen when our body responds to influenza. The body produces a whole lot of compounds which are supposed to fight the viral infection. They're things we call lymphokines or cytokines, but they're the things that actually make you feel ill. They give you the fever, they give you the muscular aches and pains, but they can do other nasty things on occasions, such as dislodging plaque from your carotid arteries, and that plaque can go to the brain or to the lungs or to the heart and can cause thrombosis, can cause myocardial infarction, heart attack, or can cause a stroke. So influenza can do some really nasty things. And on rare occasions, it can also infect the heart or brain tissues and cause its affecting that way. What's the impact of influenza? Well, WHO feel that somewhere between 3 and 5 million cases of serious illness occur a year. Somewhere between 250,000 deaths occur. Pandemics are terrible outbreaks, and I won't dwell on those because they're a very special case. In Australia, we've done some work which shows that between 1,500 and maybe 2,500 deaths occur a year, a lot of it by this excess mortality. Probably something like 18,000 people hospitalised and about 300,000 GP visits, excess GP visits on an average. And the cost of the healthcare system is something like $85 million. We've got an old estimate that suggests that about 1.5 million days of work are lost a year. But based on some more recent work in 2007 from the US, where they recorded 44 million work days lost, it's likely to be double that. So we're probably looking at over 3 million absentee work days a year in Australia. And about 10 to 12% of work absences are thought to be due to influenza during a year, and each of those, on average, is probably going to be about 4.8 days. Again, I won't dwell on pandemics, but I'll move straight on to our own recent survey that we did through the ISG, looking at what we call presenteeism. And what we found was in a wide-ranging questionnaire, about 90% of Australians have gone to work when they're suffering typical influenza symptoms. And a whole variety of reasons. They didn't think it was necessarily serious enough, they don't want to let their colleagues down, they don't want work building up and missing deadlines. But one of the nasty and surprising things is a very recent survey done in the US showed very much the same sort of things was happening with hospital interns, residents, doctors. And a good percentage of those felt responsibility care for their patients, which is a little incongruous because an ill doctor with influenza dealing with people who are already seriously ill is likely to actually pass the infection on and kill their patient. Almost 70% of Australians also participated in social activities, but on the other hand, most of them, about 61%, believe that a person with flu symptoms should actually stay at home. So it's more a matter of do as I say, not as I do.